I've been a lifelong boating enthusiast and long ago discovered that a bad day on the water is far more enjoyable than a good day on the office. Now, my wife Helene might not completely agree with that, because she will remember when we came across Lake Ontario several years back in our trawler and had an awful passage between Oswego and Kingston, largely because I misread the weather forecast. This is normally a trip that would take us 4.5 hours regular steaming between the two ports, but we bounced around for 10 solid hours trying to get to Kingston, and it was not exactly the most enjoyable voyage of our life. The eastern end of Lake Ontario can get a little bumpy, and this was not our finest trip, I have to say. We had been traveling down the Erie Barge Canal to and from New York City, and we're on our way home. And here we are moored at a couple of lock stations on the way south from Oswego to Manhattan. This is one of the most scenic trips you can make in North America. The Erie Barge Canal runs from Lake Erie across New York State and comes into Oswego, where it heads straight for the Hudson River and eventually down to New York City. Oswego has a small sector canal that connects to the main Erie Barge Canal, and that's where we started. It was built by the first President Clinton, and the whole idea was to provide a calm water route for produce from the American Midwest so that it could be taken to the South Sea Streetport in Manhattan and then transshipped from there to Europe. In those days, the Erie Barge Canal was a hive of industrial activity, as you can see from these early photographs with steam tugs in the foreground. We were on a trip to try and enjoy that lovely, historic and very picturesque waterway. During this current pandemic, I resolved to acquire 3 new skills. The first one was how to master iMovie and produce these short films. Another was to try and build a wooden boat in my driveway, which is the subject of this film. And the third was to try and learn to play the ukulele. Unfortunately, I'm still plinking when I should be plonking, and frankly, it needs a heck of a lot more work. I love being on the water, and the first time in ages I found myself without a boat. So my thoughts turned to rectifying this by buying a wooden boat, until I checked out the prices on the internet and became motivated to build my own boat all alone during the pandemic from scratch. My initial thinking was to design an open boat about 17 feet long and with a decent amount of freeboard, and a design which could be easily driven by a low power outboard engine. I looked at several designs and came to the conclusion that it might be more efficient and perhaps a little less challenging if I bought a set of plans from a boat designer and used that as my guide. The plans were perfectly fine. In fact, they were quite remarkable, but they did present 1 or 2 issues for me. Now, boat building to the uninitiated can be something of a mysterious process, particularly when you start thinking about the ratio of length to beam and then what draft is required, and the need to build chine into the boat, which inhibits rolling, and as the boat moves along it tends to deflect some of the spray. This is quite a challenge, and there are a few experienced boat designers offering plans for sale that might just be an easy way to go. And as you can see from these clips, these plans are pretty detailed but somewhat tiny. So I eventually bought a design plan for a hybrid boat which looks a bit like a Newfoundland dory with some of the characteristics of a Carolina skiff. Frankly, I was surprised to find that someone had blended those 2 boats together, but they work quite well independently, and I was really impressed that when I'd finished it, it basically worked as the designer intended. The planning process was interesting in itself, and I was following a new trend which avoids using special costly woods in favor of what's available in the lumberyard. But nowadays, thanks to technological advances with epoxy, it's possible to use lower cost wood and end up with a perfectly capable boat. The epoxy actually renders it totally impermeable as long as the surface of epoxy has not been breached. The technique is not that complex. You apply an initial coat of epoxy which generally sinks beneath the surface, and as that's drying, a second coat is applied, basically as a sealer. 2 coats will generally create a decent waterproof surface, and when you partner this epoxy with fiberglass cloth, which is applied after the epoxy is completed, and at least 2 layers, you create a stable protective outer coat for the boat. I made a mistake when buying the plans because they require a modest amount of lofting. And that in no way is a negative comment on the designers, I have to say. What I received were small-scale drawings that needed expanding to a full-size format so I could cut the wood to size. That process is called lofting. Just when I thought that challenge was over, it appeared that my full-size drawings were not quite accurate enough. So it was back to the drafting table with a yardstick and even a pantograph in hand to try and get the proportions just right. Boat building can be a highly effective way to spend an amazing amount of money in a relatively short time. It has been likened to standing in a shower stall, tearing up $100 bills while a strong fan pushes wind across your face to replicate a sailing experience. I've worked with epoxy for many years, and to some extent with fiberglass cloth, never in such a structural sense as building an entire boat. So the process does take a little bit of planning, and I needed to understand the timing attached to the 2-coat epoxy technique, and then a similar timing for laying up the fiberglass cloth on top of the hull. It should be explained that building upside down is the preferred method of small boat construction, with the keel pointing upwards and the hull facing down to the earth. This might seem a little odd at first, but it really does work, I can assure you. The efficiency of building this way becomes pretty obvious once you start assembling the ribs and attaching the plywood to skin of the boat. However, it quickly becomes apparent that sometime in the not distant future, I would have to turn the boat over right side up, and how was I about to do that? How to turn 948 pounds of wooden boat the right way up became a preoccupation and a bit of a conundrum, to be honest. What I also need to share with you is that historic Barrowfield village where I live has a strong tradition of wooden boat building. And here are some images from the lower town in Barrowfield with James Knapp, boat builder, taking a look at some of the older original homes, and a lovely painting which gives you some perspective of Kingston in the background. Of course, the boat builder Jacob Sharman, one of the streets is named after him, and a marvelous painting of the little bridge across to Kingston itself. And lastly, drilling troops for action in the First World War on Barrowfield Common quite near. Another important historical outcome of the War of 1812 was the completion of the 202-kilometre Rideau Canal, which stretches from Kingston to Ottawa. This was built as a precautionary measure against an attack from the United States, and it's now a glorious recreational boating route linking my home in Kingston to the capital in Ottawa. We've actually made several round trips on the Rideau Canal from Kingston to Ottawa, and it is one of the most beautiful waterways you can imagine, wonderfully taken care of by Parks Canada and a real treat to pursue. And it was now time to start assembling all the wood that we needed for the project. This included several sheets of construction-grade 4x8 plywood, which is made with waterproof glue, which holds the material together in all weather. A significant number of 2x4 lengths of wood, 80 feet of 2x1 stringers, and a single 16 feet long 2x6 for the keel of the boat. Along with the wood, I assembled a large selection of deck screws of various lengths and thicknesses suitable for outside work, a set of galvanized keel bolts, several cans of epoxy, about 90 feet of 6-ounce fiberglass cloth for the hull. I would eventually need marine primer, top coat and bilge paint, plus close cell foam to insert between the ribs and the outer skin as additional flotation. First, I needed to design what is aptly called a strongback. And to do this, I was carefully following the plans to make sure that I had the right proportions that would be capable for the construction job I had in mind. Now, this is a basic wood frame on which the upside down structure will be temporarily attached, bearing in mind this will have to support about 940 pounds of wood.
I tested this by putting 2 or 3 ribs on initially, and it seemed to work okay.
Next, I needed to construct the 9 ribs for the boat, which would form the basic structure.
And as you can see here, they were drawn in reasonably good detail for me to follow.
Each of these were slightly unique to reflect the curvature and the depth of the hull, and this is where my lack of patience was frankly tested to the extreme. Although most of them were right first time, a few had to be redesigned because I simply has misjudged the patterns.
It's lucky that the sound of my circular saw drowned out my sorrows.
Each rib was temporarily attached to the top of the strongback, and I was constantly eyeballing the shape. This was creating and running lengths of white tape to keep track of the profile of the hull.
As the ribs progressed and I put them on the strongback, I just wanted to make sure they were looking right.
Each rib had a slot cut into the top, which became the bottom once the boat was turned upside down to accept the keel, which ran the entire length from stem to stern. At this point in the build process, any imperfections in the ribs immediately showed up, because if they were not accurate, the keel would refuse to sit inside the misaligned slots.
And this image will give you some idea of how critical this was and how it looked.
Seeing the keel sitting along the length of the boat was quite encouraging, and I was able to stand back for a moment or two and visualize the finished boat. But it would be misrepresenting my boat building skills if I presented this as a totally linear process, which it was not. In reality, it was more of a zigzag process where a couple of things went wrong, I had to redo them, but seeing the keel more or less where it should be, I have to admit, was marginally encouraging. Once I was comfortable with the skeleton ribs and the keel structure, it was time to fabricate the transom.
So I first laid out the basic design on a board and started drafting.
And sadly, once more, I misread the plans and ended up with a totally oversized assembly. Going back to the plans for a total rethink was immediately necessary, and before long I had a second version fabricated which mercifully matched the end profile of the first rib and looked more or less in scale with the skeleton.
What you're looking at here is the transom framing before the sandwich of ply took place.
I ended up covering the stringers in a series of old rags which I soaked in bucket loads of hot water. This was not the total solution, I have to say, but it did prevent the anticipated splitting, and I ended up with 0 kindling from that part of the construction.
This process took every clamp that I had and even a few more, but I seemed to be able to pull it together without too much difficulty.
Once the skeleton was this advanced, it was time to start thinking about how to skin the boat with my 4x8 sheets of construction plywood. And if bending slim stringers around the curvature of the ribs was challenging, how would I persuade the plywood to take a similar curved journey?
Plywood will only bend in one direction, so this took a little bit of ingenuity, and as you can see from underneath the boat, it looked quite handsome when we'd finished.
Well, as plywood comes in 4x8 sheets, and as my boat was 17 feet long, there was no way a single sheet would wrap around one side of the boat. So first part of the strategy was to reduce each sheet into 2x8 strips and maneuver the rest around the main curve. That was not too difficult, and having only one bend to cope with, that might be part of the solution. However, not so quick. There was a minor curve at the front of the boat, and having the ply cut into a 2x8 strip made it that easier to move it around the curve.
One of the biggest challenges I had was handling 4x8 sheets of ply on my own, but somehow I figured this out.
I mentioned earlier the necessity of applying epoxy to all of the wood components, so each rib and each stringer had been carefully treated to ensure they were impervious to water. It was a similar epoxy soaking process with each sheet of plywood, specifically the end grain, which is arguably the most susceptible part of any wood component. I was now planning to cover the boat with 2 layers of fiberglass cloth, which could be a bit tricky given the compound curvature of the structure.
And one of the strategies here was to simply lay the fiberglass on the boat and leave it to relax for 24 hours.
There are 2 schools of thought when applying fiberglass cloth. One method is to lay up the cloth over the boat while the second coat of epoxy was still wet. And the other method is to lay it up dry and brush the epoxy through the weft and the weave of the cloth with a stiff bristle brush to ensure it actually penetrates.
This is 6-ounce fiberglass cloth, and it did tend to move around a little bit in the wind, but generally was rather manageable, I would say.
But as I was working totally alone, I found the former method to be rather difficult, as the epoxy tends to grab the glass and it takes on a life of its own. So I chose the latter, and this method is quite interesting because when the cloth soaks up the epoxy, it becomes totally transparent, which is a wonderful indicator that the cloth has been sufficiently wetted and has sufficient epoxy to allow a successful chemical bond. The transom was still on my mind, to be honest, because I was not entirely convinced that I had dimensioned it correctly. And when the boat was this far advanced, I had little appetite for ripping it apart and destroying some of my work. The bad news is there was definitely a design issue caused by me, I would say. But the good news is it was easy, although rather unsightly, to fix this. And what I had miscalculated was the length of the shaft on the outboard engine that I was planning to buy. Now, with the current height of the transom, the propeller would be almost out of the water when I put the engine on the back. And the remedy was quite dramatic looking, but due to the robust nature of the structure, it was relatively painless to execute.
And as you can see from this image, I needed to cut the transom down by quite a bit.
This necessitated cutting a 6-inch section out of the center of the transom, which allowed me to mount my 30 horsepower Yamaha
in a far more practical position than previously,
and locate the lower end of the shaft well in the water. This amounted to attacking my transom with one of these tools, which is a sawzall. It's rather a violent machine, but the cuts were pretty accurate, I have to say, and I was able to reseal the end grain with more epoxy and again cover it up with sufficient fiberglass to make it all work. So turning the boat over was now only about 10 days away, and although I had this mostly planned, I was still combing the internet to learn how others have approached this procedure. I am constantly amazed at how ingenious people are when it comes to figuring out a problem. And the successful contraptions and amazing methods for turning over large boats was amusing, it was instructional, and frankly, it was quite inspirational. One chap's method entailed building a cylindrical bracket at each end of the boat, which allowed it to become a spit, suspended at each end and rotated literally by the hand of a child. Another method was building a temporary circular wheel structure around the entire boat, and when that was fixed, simply rolling the boat over with the help of a few friends. Very, very ingenious. And another method was lifting the boat on one side and restraining it with a winch cable attached to an ATV, and then allowing the boat to slowly roll over onto a couple of old mattresses. My method was to rent 2 engine hoists and using a 3-inch wide strap at each end to lift the boat clear of the strongback, suspending it in the air while I slipped underneath and dismantled the supports.
This seemed to work quite well, and we soon had the strongback disassembled and the boat lowered to within a couple of inches of the ground and ready for dismantling.
We simply lowered it onto an old carpet where we were able to tilt the boat onto its side,
taking particular care not to stress the side of the boat until we had it sitting in a reasonably stable position and everyone was happy.
and eventually onto its keel. And frankly, my support team was absolutely exceptional. Seeing my boat the right way up was a wonderful moment after struggling with the construction process.
Although I had no illusions about how much more work we had to do.
But two significant challenges lay ahead. Somehow I had to lift the boat onto the trailer and then design the interior to be reasonably attractive while offering a degree of functionality. Using one of the engine hoists, I thought I could lift the front of the boat sufficiently high to get it onto the back of the trailer about third way onto the bunks.
This was quite effortless, as the hoist was good for 2,000 pounds and I was lifting 940.
And once I'd got that, the team were able to push the rest of the boat onto the bunks because they were covered in carpet and were relatively slippery.
This made a great difference because the boat was now mobile and we could move it around in order to position it wherever we needed.
Designing the inside of the boat was an exercise in trial and error. I first tried to fabricate plywood panels, but the look was quite unpleasant and I really needed to rethink that process. The original skeleton cast my thinking back to how satisfying that process was.
This kind of encouraged me to consider a similar look inside the boat if I could figure out how to do it.
And I resolved to try and duplicate that look inside the boat, as best as I could anyway. The first attempt was interesting, to say the least, because the radius those stringers had to bend through was slightly more severe inside the boat than on the exterior.
I also wanted to ensure that the stringers covered up the blue styrofoam which we have for flotation on either side.
And once more I had visions of kindling, cracking and forming in my garden, bits of wood flying all over, but as luck came to the rescue and helped me persuade the 1x2s to curve around the inside, giving me the linear look I was hoping to achieve.
The other effect is quite optical, and it seems to give the boat a slightly greater length than it truly has.
Not so easy with the floor, because I wanted the ability to rapidly take up various sections to check for leaks and, if necessary, to service them from inside the boat. I decided to fabricate the floor in 4 separate sections, which was relatively easy, but on reflection I decided to keep the center of the boat free because amidships would be the perfect place to hold my engine battery, fuel tanks, a box of supplies and some food for whatever journey we were going on.
And while we were doing this, I decided to go a little further and fabricate 3 athwartship seats.
This design feature remains a work in progress, to be perfectly honest, and I need more use out of the boat to see if it works as intended. I was really happy that on my 2-hour test run in the water, the hull of the boat remains totally dry.
And even more encouraging, the boat floated totally level, starboard and port completely even.
But there was a modest amount of spray entering from the 2 gaps on either side of the outboard, and I may be able to fix this with a flexible flap which I might be able to fabricate out of solid neoprene fabric. At the base of the transom I bored a hole right through the boat to the outside and bonded a 6-inch plastic tube. This is actually part of a garden sprinkler outfit and with a threaded cap on either end, so if the boat takes any water or if we get some rain in the boat, I can simply put it on the trailer, tilt it up and drain the water out and end up with a dry boat. Over the years I have seen a trend to over-engine small runabouts, and I just didn't want to fall into the same trap. As an example, the designers of my boat actually advocated between 55 and 70 horsepower, which I thought was completely absurd, and eventually decided to actually buy a 35 horsepower Yamaha 4-stroke with an appropriately matched propeller. Given the hull profile and coupled with the combined weight of the boat and its occupants, I took a deep breath and went for a 35. Before testing the boat under power, I splashed it into the nearby Cataraqui River and observed the inner part of the hull for a good 60 minutes to check for leaks.
I was also happy to see that it floated totally even.
Happily, the entire hull was perfectly dry, with the exception of that little trickle at the aft end. I had not sealed the drain plug. My good friends Dan Walton and Detlef Stein accompanied me on these 2 test runs. With only 35 horsepower on the back, frankly, I was more than pleased with how the boat performed with 2 adults and supplies. The Yamaha is actually very sophisticated, with a built-in computer and engine trim controls built into the tiller, which allows me to bring the bow of the boat down and then trim the prop upwards if I'm running in shallow water. The 35 horsepower moves along very, very smartly, and although I didn't do any direct speed runs, I'm estimating we were running at about 20 miles an hour, and we were only using a half to 2/3 throttle. The build program of my boat took 45 days from day one to the end, and I must say it was one of the most interesting things I have done, and my way of looking at the pandemic and say I'm going to be productive while this is happening. I appreciate you joining me on this episode. Building the boat was quite a life experience, and I hope perhaps you might be encouraged to do the same one day. Take good care.